They told her to bring the coffee. That was her first job, her only job, to be a shadow in a room where giants made history. The conference room on the 88th floor of the Maxwell Corp Tower wasn't just a room. It was a cathedral of glass and steel, built to worship at the altar of capital. Sunlight, sharp and unforgiving, sliced through the floor-to-ceiling windows, glinting off the chrome legs of the 30-foot table and the polished faces of the men who sat around it. They were closing the biggest merger in the company's history, a multi-billion-dollar deal that would rewrite the future of telecommunications. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, old leather, and the electric hum of victory. And in the corner, almost perfectly still, stood Imani Washington. She was 23, a legal intern on a scholarship, the only black face in the room. She was there to be invisible. Her instructions, delivered that morning by the firm's senior partner, a woman with a smile as sharp and thin as a paper cut, had been simple. Keep the coffee fresh, the water glasses full, and your mouth shut. You're lucky to even be breathing this air, Imani. Watch, learn, and don't get in the way. Imani had nodded, her face a placid mask she'd perfected over years of existing in spaces that weren't designed for her. Inside, her heart beat a frantic, silent drum. Lucky, she didn't feel lucky. She felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of a world she desperately wanted to conquer. Gene Maxwell, the CEO of Maxwell Corp., a man with a booming laugh and eyes that held the friendly but naive glint of old money, raised his crystal glass. To the future, to a partnership that will not only dominate the market but redefine it. Arthur, my friend, it's been a hell of a ride. Across the table, Arthur Sterling, the CEO of the acquiring company, Sterling Dynamics, smiled back. It was a predator's smile, all teeth and practiced warmth. He was handsome, silver-haired, the kind of man who could sell a hurricane to a coastal town. To us, Gene, may our shared vision be as profitable as it is revolutionary. The room erupted in a chorus of low, appreciative laughter. Lawyers from both sides, men and women in $1,000 suits, murmured their assent. They were all sharks, sleek and well-fed, circling the scent of blood in the water, only this time the blood was ink and the kill was a signature. Imani moved with quiet efficiency. She refilled a glass here, removed an empty cup there. Her movements were fluid, economical, designed to draw zero attention. As she leaned over to clear a coaster near Miss Davies, the senior partner, the woman didn't even look up. "More coffee, Imani," she said, her voice a low, dismissive hum. "And for God's sake, try not to look so terrified. You're like a deer in headlights." Imani froze for a fraction of a second. The heat of humiliation crept up her neck. Terrified, she wasn't terrified, she was furious. She was a powder keg of ambition and frustration, packed tight and waiting for a spark. She retreated to the service cart, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted the silver coffee pot. Her reflection stared back at her from its polished surface, distorted and fragmented. But behind her own eyes, she saw another face. The ghost of her grandfather, Thurgood Washington. A man who had been one of the first black lawyers to graduate from his university, a man who fought in courtrooms where he wasn't allowed to use the same restroom as his opponents. He had given her his most prized possession on the day she was accepted into law school, a worn, leather-bound copy of the 1934 Securities Exchange Act, its margins filled with his spidery, defiant handwriting. His voice echoed in her memory, a low, steady baritone that had been her anchor her entire life. "They will underestimate you," he had told her, his dark eyes burning with a fire she now felt in her own gut. They will look right through you. They will see your skin, your gender, your youth, and they will dismiss you. Let them. Your power is in the spaces they don't watch. Read everything, Imani, especially the fine print, especially the footnotes, especially the appendices. The devil doesn't hide in the details, he lives there. Imani poured the coffee, her movements suddenly steady, her purpose sharpening to a razor's edge. They had given her a front-row seat to the signing, not as a participant, but as a servant. They had made her invisible, and in doing so, they had given her the perfect cover. The final contract was a monument to legal warfare, a stack of paper nearly a foot high, bound in dark blue leather, sitting in the center of the table like a holy text. It represented 6 months of brutal negotiations, hundreds of lawyers, and millions in legal fees. No one was reading it now. It was a trophy, a symbol of the closed deal. The real work, they assumed, was done. Imani's designated role was to manage the signature pages, Appendix D. She was to lay them out, provide the ceremonial pens, and then whisk the signed documents away to be scanned and couriered. It was a glorified secretarial task, meant to make her feel included while keeping her utterly irrelevant. But as she stood by the side table, pretending to organize the pens, her eyes devoured the open pages. The other lawyers were laughing, telling war stories from the negotiation. Mr. Maxwell was reminiscing about a golf game. Arthur Sterling was charming a junior executive. No one was watching her. No one ever did. Her grandfather's words again, the devil lives in the appendices. Her fingers brushed against the thick, expensive paper. The main body of the contract was standard. Boilerplate language, reciprocal clauses, the usual corporate dance. She'd reviewed drafts of it online, late at night in her tiny apartment, just to feel like she was part of the team. But this was the final version, the one that mattered. With a feigned sense of duty, she separated the signature pages and began laying them out, but her eyes weren't on the signature lines. They were scanning the pages just before it, Appendix C, post-merger governance and strategic realignment protocols. It was dense, filled with jargon designed to be impenetrable, a graveyard of legalese where only the most determined would venture. Her eyes moved faster and faster, her brain, a machine trained by her grandfather's ghost, processing clauses and sub-clauses. It was all there, standard stuff, board composition, shareholder rights. Then she saw it. It was tucked away at the bottom of a page, a single paragraph that looked as harmless as a field mouse. It was titled, simply, Market Fluctuation Contingency. Her breath hitched. Her blood went cold. The clause stated that if the newly merged company's stock price experienced a period of significant volatility, defined as a drop of 15% or more below its initial offering price for 3 consecutive trading days within the first 6 months, Sterling Dynamics would have the unilateral right to trigger a strategic realignment committee. This committee, the clause continued, would be granted temporary majority voting power on the board to stabilize the asset and protect shareholder value. It was a trap door, a beautifully engineered, perfectly legal corporate kill switch. The stock market was fickle. A 15% drop wasn't just possible, it was easily manipulated. A well-timed negative press release, a leaked rumor, a targeted short sell, Arthur Sterling could trigger that clause whenever he wanted. And once he did, the Strategic Realignment Committee, which the fine print revealed would be comprised of members appointed solely by Sterling Dynamics, would have total control. They could fire the board, liquidate assets, gut Maxwell Corp from the inside out. Gene Maxwell wasn't getting a partner, he was getting an executioner. Imani looked up. The room was aglow with self-congratulation. The ceremonial pens, heavy and gold-plated, lay gleaming on the table. Mr. Maxwell was standing, his hand outstretched toward Arthur Sterling, his smile wide and trusting. "Well, Arthur," he boomed, "shall we make it official?" Sterling's smile widened. "It would be my absolute pleasure, Jean." Imani's heart hammered against her ribs. The sound was a deafening roar in her ears. Every instinct screamed at her to stay silent. She was an intern. A nobody. Speaking up would be professional suicide. They would not just fire her, they would obliterate her. Miss Davis's sneering face flashed in her mind. Don't get in the way. She looked at the contract, at the clause lying in wait like a coiled snake. Then she looked at her hands. On her right palm was a small, pale scar, a faint white line from when she'd fallen out of a tree as a child, trying to see the world from a higher vantage point. Her grandfather had cleaned the wound, stitched it himself, and told her, "Scars are not a sign of weakness, Imani. They are a sign that you fell and you got back up. They are a sign that you are a survivor." She was a survivor. She was Thurgood Washington's granddaughter, and she would not be silent. She had to be smart. A public outburst would be dismissed as hysteria. She needed to follow the chain of command, even if the chain was made of ice. She saw her opening when Miss Davies stepped away from the table to take a call in the corner, her back to the room. Imani moved, a whisper of motion, and appeared at her side. "Miss Davies," she said, her voice low but urgent. Davies waved a dismissive hand, still listening to her phone. "Not now, Imani." "Ma'am, it's about the contract. It's critical." That got her attention. Davies covered the phone's receiver, her eyes narrowing into icy slits. "What did you say?" "Appendix C, Clause 11.4b, Imani whispered, her heart pounding. "It's a contingency clause, a trap. It gives Sterling unilateral control if the stock dips. It's a corporate kill switch." Miss Davies stared at her. For a terrifying second, there was no expression on her face at all. Then a slow, contemptuous smile spread across her lips. It was the most brutal expression Imani had ever seen. "Let me get this straight," Davies said, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. "You, the intern who is here to pour coffee, believes you have found a flaw in a multi-billion-dollar merger agreement that has been reviewed by over 200 lawyers from 3 of the top firms in the country." Imani stood her ground. "Yes," the smile vanished. "Get out of my sight," she hissed. "You are embarrassing yourself, and you are embarrassing this firm. We have a saying for interns who get too big for their britches, Imani. We say they don't have a future. Now go get the champagne flutes ready, and if you breathe another word of this fantasy to anyone, I will personally see to it that you never work in a legal office again, not even as a janitor." The words hit Imani like a physical blow. They were designed to break her, to put her back in her place, to remind her that she was nothing. For a moment they almost worked. The air left her lungs, the room swam before her eyes. She saw her future, a vast and promising landscape shriveling into a barren desert. She backed away, her face burning, the sting of tears threatening behind her eyes. But as she retreated, her humiliation curdled into something else, something hard and cold and defiant. "Fine." She looked back at the main table. The lawyers were taking their seats again. The final documents were being passed around. The gold pens were being uncapped. Jean Maxwell was beaming, a lamb being led to a slaughter he had paid for. Arthur Sterling was watching him, that predatory gleam in his eyes more pronounced than ever. Miss Davies had returned to her seat, shooting Imani a look that promised annihilation. They had built a wall of silence around her, a wall of condescension, of dismissal, of threat. Imani took a deep breath. Her grandfather's voice was back, no longer a memory but a command. Sometimes, child, when they won't give you a door, you have to become the damn battering ram. She looked at the wall they had built, and she prepared to run right through it. The room fell into a reverent hush. The moment had arrived. Jean Maxwell and Arthur Sterling sat at the head of the table, the blue-bound contract between them. The signature page, Appendix D, was open, pristine. Waiting, Maxwell picked up the heavy gold pen. Sterling picked up his. Their eyes met across the table, a universe of lies passing between them disguised as a partnership. Maxwell smiled, his folksy charm filling the silence. "Ready to make history, Arthur," Sterling nodded, his own smile a mask of triumph. "Born ready, Jean." The room held its breath. The lawyers leaned in, their faces rapt. Miss Davies shot one last, venomous glare at Imani, a silent order to remain invisible. The pens lowered. The nibs, sharp and black, hovered an inch from the paper. $1 billion empire hung in the balance, suspended in a single heart-stopping moment of silence. And into that silence a voice cut through the air, clear, calm, unshakable. "Excuse me." The pens froze. Every head turned. Slowly, as if in a dream, every pair of eyes in that room, the CEO, the lawyers, the partners, swiveled to the corner of the room, to the shadow by the service cart. To the intern, to Imani Washington. She stood with her back straight, her chin up, her hands clasped behind her back. She looked small against the vastness of the glass wall behind her, a solitary figure against the skyline of the city. But her voice had been a thunderclap. Miss Davis's face went white with fury. She looked like she was about to leap across the table and throttle Imani with her bare hands. Jean Maxwell blinked, confused. He gave a nervous chuckle. "I'm sorry, did someone say something?" Imani took a single step forward, out of the shadows, into the light. "I did, Mr. Maxwell," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was a runaway train. Arthur Sterling set his pen down, slowly, deliberately. His friendly mask was gone. In its place was a face of cold, reptilian stillness. He stared at Imani, his eyes like chips of ice. Miss Davies spoke, her voice a strained, furious hiss. "Imani, that is enough. You will leave this room, now." "No," Imani replied, her gaze locked on Jean Maxwell. "I don't think I will." She addressed Maxwell directly, her tone respectful but firm, ignoring the daggers being thrown from every other person in the room. "Sir, I apologize for the interruption. My name is Imani Washington. I'm a legal intern with the firm. And I cannot, in good conscience, allow you to sign that document." A wave of shocked murmurs swept the room. Lawyers looked at each other, their faces a mixture of disbelief and outrage. Maxwell looked utterly bewildered. He glanced from Imani to Miss Davies as if for an explanation. "What is the meaning of this, Patricia?" Miss Davies stood, her face flushed a blotchy red. "Jean, I am so sorry. This is a disciplinary issue, a rogue intern. It will be handled." She turned to Imani. "I told you to be silent," but Imani's focus was a laser beam on Maxwell. "Sir, with all due respect to Miss Davies, this is not a disciplinary issue. This is a survival issue for your company." Arthur Sterling finally spoke, his voice dangerously soft. "Young lady, I think you are severely out of your depth." "On the contrary, Mr. Sterling," Imani said, turning to face him, "I think I am the only person in this room who is not." She took another step toward the table. "Please," she said to Maxwell, her voice ringing with a desperate sincerity that cut through the hostility. "Before you sign, I beg you to turn to Appendix C, page 28, Clause 11.4b. The room went dead silent. The clause number hung in the air like a poisoned dart. You could hear the sound of blood rushing in ears, the quiet, frantic shifting of bodies in expensive chairs. The high-paid lawyers, the sharks, the giants of the corporate world, they were all staring at a 23-year-old intern who had just called their bluff in front of everyone. Maxwell, looking more lost than ever, hesitated, and in his hesitation, Imani saw her chance. She pressed on, her voice gaining strength, each word a hammer blow against the wall of their arrogance. "It's called the market fluctuation contingency, sir, and it's a trap." The word hung in the air. Trap. It was an accusation so profound, so audacious, that for a moment no one knew how to react. The spell of the celebratory signing was shattered. Then chaos. A frantic rustling of paper erupted as lawyers on Maxwell's side scrambled for their copies of the contract, their faces etched with a dawning horror. They looked like men who had just been told the ship they were on was not only sinking but had been designed to do so from the start. Miss Davies was frantically whispering into her phone, her voice a choked, panicked squeak. The other partners from her firm were huddled together, their expressions of smug superiority replaced by pure, unadulterated panic. They had missed it, all of them. Gene Maxwell, his face pale, fumbled through the massive document, his hands shaking. He found the appendix, he found the clause, he read it once, then twice. His jaw went slack. The friendly, naive light in his eyes flickered and died, replaced by the cold, hard glint of betrayal. He looked up, not at the lawyers he was paying millions of dollars, but at Imani. "Explain," he said, his voice a raw whisper. Across the table, Arthur Sterling remained unnervingly still. He hadn't moved, he hadn't reached for the contract. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what it said. His mask of charm had dissolved completely, revealing the frozen, predatory core beneath. His eyes were fixed on Imani, and the look in them was murderous. He had been caught, exposed by a ghost. Imani stepped forward, her voice now commanding the room. "That clause gives Sterling Dynamics the unilateral right to seize control of the board if the company's stock drops 15% for just 3 consecutive days in the first 6 months," she explained, her words sharp and precise. "It's a manufactured crisis trigger. A dip like that can be easily engineered through a targeted short sell, a negative PR leak, any number of tactics. The moment it's triggered, a strategic realignment committee is formed, and according to the sub-clause in 11.4c, that committee's members are appointed exclusively by Sterling Dynamics." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "You wouldn't be merging, Mr. Maxwell. You would be handing Mr. Sterling the keys to your kingdom. He could dismantle this company, sell off its assets, and fire your entire leadership team, and it would all be perfectly legal, signed and sealed by you." A choked sound came from one of Maxwell's lawyers. "My God," he breathed, staring at the page as if it were a venomous snake. "She's right." Gene Maxwell slowly raised his head and looked at Arthur Sterling. The transformation in his face was terrifying. The folksy warmth was gone, burned away by a white-hot rage. "You son of a bitch," he snarled, his voice low and guttural. "You were going to gut me." Arthur Sterling's composure finally cracked. A flicker of sheer fury crossed his face. He stood up, knocking his chair back. "This is an outrage. An intern's paranoid delusion is derailing a multi-billion-dollar deal. Our legal teams approved this." "Your teams approved this." "My teams," Maxwell said, his voice dripping with ice as he glared at his own lawyers, who shrank under his gaze, "are about to be fired." He then turned his full attention back to Sterling. "But you put it there, you wrote the damn trap." Sterling pointed a trembling finger at Imani. This is because of her, a nobody. You're going to listen to her. Maxwell's voice dropped to a deadly calm. I'm not just listening to her. I'm thanking God for her. He stood, his presence suddenly formidable. He was no longer the naive old man. He was a king whose castle had almost been taken by a Trojan horse. The deal is off, Arthur. Get out of my building. Sterling stared, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent rage. He had been so close. He had outmaneuvered the best legal minds in the country, only to be taken down by an intern he wouldn't have trusted to fetch his dry cleaning. He turned, his eyes landing on Amani one last time. It was a look of pure hatred, a promise of retribution. Then, without another word, he stormed out of the room, his own legal team trailing behind him like beaten dogs. The room was left in a state of stunned, echoing silence. The billion-dollar deal was dead, and the person who had killed it was the one person no one had thought to watch. The silence that followed Sterling's exit was heavier than the one before. It was the silence of shame, of shock, of a world turned upside down. The high-paid lawyers from Maxwell's side avoided eye contact with everyone. They were shuffling papers, muttering to each other, their authority stripped bare. Miss Davies stood frozen, her face the color of ash. Her career, she knew, was over. She had not only missed the kill-shot clause, but had actively tried to silence the person who found it. She had failed on every conceivable level. Gene Maxwell sank back into his chair, his face in his hands. He took a few deep, shuddering breaths. The magnitude of his near-fatal mistake washed over him. He had almost given away his father's company, his entire legacy, for a handshake and a predatory smile. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes scanning the room full of disgraced experts. They had all failed him. Then his gaze landed on Amani, who was still standing near the head of the table, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. In that moment, she was the only person in the room who held any authority. She had been the only one with clarity, the only one with courage. Maxwell cleared his throat. The room, which had started to buzz with panicked whispers, fell silent again. Everyone looked at him. He spoke, his voice hoarse with emotion, but clear. And he wasn't speaking to his lawyers or his partners or anyone else. He was speaking to Amani. "What?" he asked, his voice filled with a raw, desperate humility. "Do you suggest we do now, Miss Washington?" The question was a seismic shift. The power in the room tilted, recentered, and settled squarely on her shoulders. Miss Washington. He hadn't just used her last name, he had given her a title. He had given her the respect that every other person in that room had denied her. It was the quietest, most profound form of revenge. It was the victory not just for her, but for her grandfather, for every underestimated soul who had ever been told to just serve the coffee. Miss Davies flinched as if she had been slapped. Her own CEO, the man she had tried to impress by belittling her intern, was now asking that same intern for legal counsel in front of the entire firm. Amani didn't hesitate. She met his gaze, her own eyes clear and focused. "First," she said, her voice ringing with the authority she had just been granted, "you instruct your legal team to draft a notice of termination for the merger agreement, citing bad faith and attempted fraudulent inducement. Second, you begin immediate internal and external audits to assess how this clause was missed and to ensure no other such vulnerabilities exist. And third," she paused, taking a deep breath, "you file a formal complaint against Sterling Dynamics with the Securities and Exchange Commission." Each point was a nail in the coffin of the old power structure. She wasn't just giving advice, she was dictating the terms of survival. Maxwell nodded slowly, absorbing her words. He looked at his shell-shocked legal team. You heard her. Do it. Then he turned back to Imani, a new light in his eyes. It was a look of profound, unadulterated respect. I have one more question for you, Miss Washington. Sir, when can you start? The aftermath was swift and brutal. Maxwell Corp's press release hit the wires an hour later, announcing the termination of the merger due to irreconcilable differences in corporate governance and ethical standards. The stock market, which had been buzzing with anticipation, reeled. Sterling Dynamics stock plummeted. The SEC complaint, filed the next day, triggered a federal investigation that would haunt Arthur Sterling for years. Miss Davies and the two senior partners who led the merger team were fired before they even left the building. They were escorted out by security, their briefcases in hand, their careers in ruins. Imani stayed. She worked with a new, hastily assembled legal team, walking them through the contract, pointing out other, more subtle vulnerabilities they had missed. She worked with a quiet, fierce intensity, fueled by coffee and the burning satisfaction of being seen, of being heard. Late that night, long after everyone else had gone home, she was alone in the cavernous conference room. The remnants of the failed celebration, empty water glasses, discarded notepads, the billion-dollar contract still sitting on the table, were all that remained. The room was dark, save for the glittering lights of the city outside the glass walls. She walked to the window and looked down at the sprawling metropolis below. It looked different now. Not like a foreign, unconquerable landscape, but like a kingdom she had just helped defend. She saw a reflection in the glass. It was Gene Maxwell, standing in the doorway. He looked older, humbled, but his eyes were clear. They're all gone, he said quietly. I know, she replied. He walked over and stood beside her, following her gaze. My grandfather started this company with a $5,000 loan and a dream. I almost pissed it all away today. He shook his head. How did you see it, Miss Washington? How did you, an intern, see what some of the most expensive lawyers in the world missed? Imani was silent for a moment. Then she turned to him. Because they were looking for a fight, she said. I was looking for the truth. And because my grandfather taught me where the devil lives. Maxwell gave a small, sad smile. He must have been a hell of a man. He was, Imani said, a wave of love and grief and pride washing over her. Maxwell reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small, elegant box. This was supposed to be a closing gift for Arthur Sterling. He opened it. Inside was a pen, solid gold, engraved with the Maxwell Corp logo. I think you've earned it more. He offered it to her. Imani looked at the pen, then back at him. She gently closed the box and pushed it back toward him. Thank you, sir, she said, but I already have one. She reached into her worn satchel and pulled out the old leather-bound book her grandfather had given her. Tucked inside was his pen, a simple, steel-nibbed fountain pen, its barrel worn smooth from decades of use. The pen that had written briefs that changed laws, that had filled the margins of books with wisdom and fire. Maxwell looked at the simple, old pen, then at the book, and he finally understood. Imani wasn't driven by money or status. She was driven by legacy. The job offer is real, Imani, he said, his voice soft. Not as an intern, not even as a junior associate. I'm creating a new position, special counsel to the CEO. You'll answer directly to me. You'll have oversight on every major contract we sign. Name your price. Imani looked out at the city lights, her heart full. She thought of her grandfather, of the battles he had fought, of the scars he had carried. She had her own now, and she was just getting started. She turned to her new boss, a small, confident smile playing on her lips. "I don't want a price," she said. "I want a promise. Promise me you'll never let this company be so blind again." Maxwell met her gaze and nodded, sealing the deal not with a signature, but with a vow. As Imani finally left the tower that night, the old book in her satchel and the weight of a new future on her shoulders, she allowed herself one last thought, a quiet tribute to the man who had forged her. Her grandfather had taught her how to read the law. She had just taught an entire corporation how to respect the blood that wrote the footnotes.